Hello, hi everybody, and welcome to Dev Talks. I'm Clement Brenot, and I'm a research manager at the Growth Lab. And today it's my great pleasure to be welcoming Professor Stefan Dercon from Oxford University for a session that will largely revolve around his latest book titled Gambling on Development. I'd like to start in the most simple way, really. My question is, why did you write this book? What was a question or maybe the questions within us that you were trying to answer?
Well, thank you very much. And look, thank you for the introduction as well. And it probably helps already to explain a little bit. You know, I'm a development economist. I'm a microeconomist. I do RCTs these days. I used to collect longitudinal data sets. I used to follow farmers for 30 years or 25 years in Ethiopia and keep on going back. So very much a micro person. But at the same time, I've always had that interest on the policy side. And when I had a chance to work as a chief economist at DFID, you know, at the time, it's now been abolished, but anyway, it was definitely quite an influential development agency, and also investing in a lot of research and work like that. But when you work more in the policy environment, you know, the big questions are always are hanging over you. You know, it's like, you know, what makes in the end a big difference? You know, there's a lot of the small changes we can do. And, you know, I have a lot of belief in lots of small things that we can do. But in the end, the big things matter, you know, and the fundamental difference. Why was it, for example, in our organization in DFID, we felt like, you know, we could make quite a lot of progress with our aid in places like Bangladesh or in Ghana or in Ethiopia, where everything we seem to be doing in Nigeria felt like, you know, you're not going to get anywhere. And so for me, the underlying question was a little bit, you know, do I understand well enough, you know, why some of the things we're doing makes a difference at scale and why not? And so this is about an impact question. But once you then deal with an impact question, this more macro question about, you know, what's driving in the end in a country, whether they are embarking on large-scale growth and large-scale poverty reduction or not, was that hanging over me. And so this is me as a microeconomist having to delve into the bigger questions as well, and to hitting fairly quickly that, well, if I look around the world, the detailed policy advice doesn't seem to be the biggest factor in change. But it seems to be a lot to do with the big things that's going on. And, you know, I remember talking at some point to Francois Bourguignon, who was at the time, had just finished to be the chief economist of the World Bank. And he said, you know, once you hit politics, you can't think of anything else anymore, because you start actually seeing that in countries, a lot of the big things happens by what's happening with the people in power and influence. And it's not, you know, we can give technical advice as economists, but we need to be aware of the bigger picture, and the bigger picture involves politics, involves political economy. And that's what I wanted to write about, that kind of thing that is much harder to test with a growth regression. We don't quite do these anymore, I think, or cross-country regressions, maybe some do, but I wouldn't. But also not with a microregression. I can't randomize political economy at scale. And so kind of thinking, you know, look, there is certain things that are bigger than what I can easily analyze, but I need to begin to understand the politics of places and the way politics and economics interact. And I think I wanted to write about it, building on the experience I had, because I had the lucky thing to work in so many different countries, spending a lot of time. I used to have the habit of moving my office in the summer to another developing country, and it just worked from there. So I spent time in China, in India, in Mozambique, in the DRC, quite a lot of time that you usually as an academic never had, and actually just see what the policy process were, what the politics was. And I just wanted to write, bringing together what I knew from reading the research, but also a lot of the experience on the ground, trying to actually see, well, how does change happen?
Thank you. That sounds like a lot of travel, and it looks like it's resulted in a lot of insights as well that we're trying to get into with you today. I wanted to go to the idea that I feel is at the heart of the book, that of a development bargain, to sort of organize how we can think about the political economy aspects that you were just mentioning. and also maybe to talk about why you call it a gamble and this risky aspect that you feel there is in trying to take that development or progress path. So I was wondering if you could maybe in a few words tell us about the main thesis of the book and why you think it is a useful way to approach these political economy questions.
So, not so long ago, Leonard Wanchacon, the economic historian at Princeton, gave a lecture at Yale, and he put it actually very nicely and said, yes, all these kind of historical, call it the Robinson-Acemoglu type of agenda of institutions, all these things matter. Structures matter, colonialism matters, all these things. But he said, even though he works quite a lot on the institutional economics, he said that's like 50%. 50% to understand what's going on in a country is the agency, and what he then actually also called the elite, the people with power, not just the president, the prime minister, but the agency of the actors on the ground that have power and influence. So this is how I also want to think about it, and there's kind of a very close alignment with the way he thinks about it. History institutions matter, but what happens at a moment in time matters as well in terms of these elite players. And so I talk in the book quite a lot about the underlying elite bargain, the kind of political scientists sometimes call it political settlement, the underlying deal between the forces in not just purely in politics, but also in the economy, maybe, well, definitely in the military, probably also in the senior civil service, maybe even civil society, journalists, public intellectuals. Those people with power and influence in a society could be 30, it could be 1,000, but actually the kind of underlying understanding they have about the boundaries on their actions and behavior. It's almost more informal than the institutions, but just how they actually do operate around power and making decisions and so on. So you could have a lot of them. You could say, as it was under Mobutu Sese Seko, totally acceptable. If you run Congo at the time, it was called Zaire under Mobutu, if you run it as a kleptocracy, purely kleptocracy, where the state, if you were controlling the state, you could steal from anyone. Like he famously told his civil servants when he had heard that people were complaining about corruption, he said, friends, I hear that people are complaining about you, that you steal from the people. Can I please ask you not to steal too much and leave a little bit for the next one, otherwise it will all go wrong. It's like if that becomes almost the principle of the kleptocracy in the whole society. You also have an awful lot of states coming often out of independence as well, and often in the political games that are being played, is that if you gain power, you should reward those who gave you power. So it's like pure clientelism. You could either reward people with jobs, with influence, you reward them with contracts and so on. So you could have lots of elite bargains, implicit deals. So what is then the essence for me? It's saying, look, given that we can have a lot of these, if I start looking what, say, the Chinas or the Indonesias or the Bangladeshis or the Indias after the 1990s, or Ghana and Ethiopia between, say, 2015 and 2020 have in common, is that underlying this elite bargain was definitely actions and behavior that were fundamentally focused on growth and development. And that was a key part of what they do, and I think often in Western countries, we've forgotten that even in our societies, until well into the 20th century, the US didn't really care about growth and development of the broader population. The New Deal probably brought it out. In the UK, similarly, and in most European countries after the First and the Second World War, it became an understanding, if you were in power and had influence, that somehow you have to care about growth and development one way or another. Now, we have actually quite a few societies where that's not the case. We also have societies at some point where those with power and influence start focusing on that. And so I call that the development bargain, where fundamentally the elite bargain wants this, not just in words, not a beautiful development plan, but actually in actions and behavior. Why do I call that a gamble? Because every elite knows the game in town, the easiest game in town to play is the status quo, because they understand it. That's the basis of their power. The distributive politics that everybody gets a little bit, that game in town is what they understand. Gambling on actually a growth trajectory where there is a great chance, and history tells us that new elites will emerge, that old elites will be displaced and so on, is quite a gamble. So you have to have either you're under so much pressure that there's no other way that you can do, or you think, you have no more legitimacy, or you've come, like as it happened in Western countries after conflict, in First and the Second World War in Europe, you need to start delivering because you have no legitimacy-seeking behavior. It's things like that that often compels an elite to do this. Because growth, yes, it's not a zero-sum game, but distributionally, it's not self-evident that it actually always will be for the present-day elite for you to improving. You may well lose your power in determining the distribution, and indeed, you may actually be a loser in it. And so that's why the gamble comes into it, which makes it even more surprising that so many countries are doing it these days. And I think in the last 20 or 30 years, that's the positive part of the story. Quite a lot of countries did it, and they did it in very different ways, with very different institutional setups, with very different political systems. Even with the kind of economic policy making, was actually quite a lot of variation in it.
That's actually at the heart of the book as well, which is structured around country chapters, is to go into the idiosyncrasies of each of these places and to show that there is no magic recipe or silver bullet to strike the development bargain. For those who haven't yet read the book, I was wondering if you could maybe give us two examples contrasting two different examples of how very development bargains both proved conducive to development.
Yeah. So no, definitely, and I'll give a couple then indeed. So the most obvious one that people always seem to think about is like China. Okay, so and that's actually very striking that we sometimes forget that China was an absolute mess in the 1970s. Mao died, the Cultural Revolution had been raging, destabilized society substantially. The Gang of Four, Mao's widow, wanted to keep this whole focus on ideology as the basis of all decision-making central. And there you actually got, a real crisis of legitimacy in that country. I remember, I'm actually old enough to somehow remember as a youngster, people talking about, will China persist? Will it continue to exist like this? The Chinese Communist Party was a real crisis. So what actually happens with Deng Xiaoping is as much to do with, convincing all the others in the party to form a coalition of reformers, to actually being able to say, we actually need to try to do this differently. We can't do everything based on ideology, but we're going to have to, in the spirit of, it doesn't matter whether the cat is white or black, as long as it catches mice, be far more pragmatic about economic policy. And so actually they choose a model of pragmatism in economic policymaking, but still strongly state-led. Why did they do it? Well, actually just for survival, for legitimacy. There's plenty of writings. And I'm always very struck, and if I have Chinese students in the audience, that's the moment when a lot of them started nodding, that actually the underlying legitimacy-seeking behavior, that was actually a crucial part of the 1980s. We need to deliver food security and then growth to the population. That was a key part of it. But they went down for state-led development. Yes, they did reform, and of course, they did governance reforms around the economy. It was much more decentralized, but it's hard to say that this became suddenly a simple, totally liberal capitalist economy. Of course, property rights were still very strongly aligned relative to the party, and the controlling role was there all there. If we then contrast it with, say, Bangladesh, a country that we like to describe as saying, and some people even would say it was a surprise, it was a miracle. In any case, Henry Kissinger was saying, or at least one of his aides wrote or said around 1981, that Bangladesh is a basket case. And I remember my very first essay in development economics was the title, Is Bangladesh a Basket Case? And I'm also old enough to be able to write then, yes, absolutely, because of demographic change, climate, all these things, nothing will ever come from Bangladesh. Of course, I was writing this in the 1980s, when it already clearly, we didn't really know it well. It was actually starting to grow fast. The garment industry developed. And also this now a country with Muslim country with girls' education and health outcomes for girls being better than for boys. And actually a real success in poverty reduction and growth, 5-6% of growth the last 20 years or so. So, well, how did they do that? Well, actually almost the opposite to what China did. in a sense that they had gone after they won the independence war in the 1970s. They went through a whole crisis period as well, with the famine of the early 1970s, the execution of the founding leader of the independence, and coups and political instability and whatever. But also very little to show for, in fact, a real crisis. In fact, Henry Kissinger had a good reason to call it a basket case by the early 1980s. But interestingly enough, what they did, although they had initially chosen for state-led development, but also they had built up a state rewarding the freedom fighters with jobs in government and the whole kind of things, the clientelist state was built up. You got to the early 1980s, where the government started to take new decisions, but actually quite different, to liberalize the fertilizer market, to denationalize some state-owned enterprises, to actually go for quite a very cautious, prudent macroeconomic policy, where they called in the IMF and they did actually all kinds of structural adjustment. And indeed, sometimes people in the central bank definitely like to say that this is Bangladesh chose laissez-faire, and it's actually total laissez-faire. It's maybe an overstatement. The state plays a role and the whole kind of thing. But it actually very different from the whole China model. And it was definitely the entrepreneurship in the garment industry that built it up. And it's now 90% of its exports or something. But also strikingly, this was a state that understood that was not very good in delivering. And actually it allowed in the 70s, but definitely in the 1980s and 90s, to get NGOs to grow. For example, BRAC, economists that study this thing, they know it's very well. These programs are very well analyzed and evaluated. But BRAC, what is most striking, well, it is the largest NGO in the world. It is actually a state within the state. The state allowed civil society to become stronger almost than the state on certain things. There is no other country in the world that I can imagine would allow this to happen. India, definitely with NGO laws, would never allow BRAC to become as big as it is. But that's a self-aware state. So rather than state-led development, it shows a much more a state that says, well, we know what we can't do, and we allow other actors to do it. And that's part of the success. So NGOs, BRAC, in fact, aid played a big role there, because probably easily more than $1 billion, if not close to $2 billion, was provided to BRAC over the last decade or so by Australia and the UK. Massive financing of their programs. Which state would usually allow an outside actor to do this? So it's a very different model, economic policy, far more liberal, and very different ways of dealing with it, but actually quite successful. So very contrasting models, not the same level of success maybe than China, but very remarkable from where it came from.
Thanks. You started to before we went into these two very interesting and contrasting examples, you started to talk about some of the contextual element, historical context that may preside over, choosing or opting for a development bargain or not. And so you mentioned the role of course, the elite's legitimacy, with this idea that maybe at some point your back is to the wall, and you maybe have a little bit more space to reinvent the growth model or the way things work in general. More broadly, I was wondering how you think about some of these either contextual or structural factors that you say are not everything, but they're still there. And some of them might be, you're talking about different historical examples. Some of them happen on the back of, let's say, favorable terms of trade dynamics, commodity booms. Some of them happened in other regional contexts that were more or less conducive to development, and also more structurally, one very important factor that economists, I think, are very split on is the role that natural resources more structurally play on the country's development path. So I was wondering how you integrated these different factors, if you think there are contextual, external, structural kind of preconditions to striking a development bargain, or whether really anything is possible because the shapes such a bargain can take can be very different. Right.
Look, history definitely constrains any country. History, geography, all these things will matter. So like a couple of things. history of China matters here, why China can be successful. In a very simple way, 2,000 years of centralized bureaucracy, 2,000 years of actually meritocracy in the bureaucratic system, centralized taxation for 2,000 years. If you're ever going to do state-led development, and I could pick a country to do it, I'll probably do it in China. It's like there's a good chance it can work because you have a nature of a state you inherited that actually has features that are not clientelist, that are not kleptocratic. And if you then put them to use for growth and development, you can do it. If I do then the reverse, colonialism delivering boundaries and borders in countries that make it just fundamentally different. There's not for nothing, even though I may be slightly dismissing cross-country growth regressions, the correlations are there, ethnofractionalization, that these things are correlated. It's all about how the causalities play out, but they are there, and the fact that you create complicated countries, it's of course much harder to do a deal between the elites in terms of how to set it up. You mentioned natural resources. It's, if it is a gamble to go for growth, if you have natural resources, your status quo is so well defined. If I go to Nigeria, I was in Nigeria last week. I had a great time. Actually, arguably, there was some private meetings organized with what the organizer said, I'll get you the elite in the room. And I must say the elite was in the room. It was quite striking audiences. I'll write about it at some point. But anyway, it was fascinating to sit there. Some of the richest people in the country, the political shakers, the controllers, and whatever. They totally got me when I said, look, the Nigerian elite bargain is simply about the distribution of oil. Fundamentally, you have about $500 per capita. If I divide it amongst all the population, that's nothing. That's 200 million people. But if I divide it amongst 100,000 people, that's $1 million per capita per year for everybody. We basically have defined the elite bargain in Nigeria. They totally get it. Some get more, some get less, but that's basically the political structure. And put it slightly differently, why would you gamble it's quite a gamble then to let that go, because you're already quite secure to get your $1 million per year. Why would you actually even be arguing for it? And maybe some only get 100,000 and a house in London. Okay, so that's then maybe a bit less, and some get $1 billion. But actually, there is a lot to lose for the elite. If you're don't have natural resources, you need every year produce the rents to be able to control. So this is how the political economy of the natural resources, of course, plays a big role. So you get these factors that will shape it. The problems of coalescing the elite bargain linked to historical factors, the natural resource endowments, making it just less likely that you will gamble, or indeed, just your whole history that has played out. So these things matter, but I'll still stick to it. That there are surprising countries. I'm talking to you now from Mauritius, lucky me. I'm in Mauritius here. Mauritius is fascinating because very few people know much about it. Beyond that, it's probably now a high-income country. In the early 1960s, a Nobel Prize winner, James Mead, he was a trade economist, actually a brilliant guy. He wrote a piece where he said that basically nothing will ever come from Mauritius. Historical structures of huge divisions with people descendants from the French controlling all the land, where you have indentured labor from the Indians in the middle, and then you have Creole, basically ex-slavery population, structures that were no way, huge ethnofractionalization. When they get independent, nothing will come from it. 1968, they become independent. Yes, they go into a full crisis fairly quickly. The 1970s were dreadful. But what seems to happen then is by the late 1970s, they recognize, and they is basically both the political elite, strongly supported by the majority Indian descent population, and the business elite, still controlled very much by the French and the sugar elite. They actually make an implicit deal, an implicit contract that has held since then, that actually they are going to go for growth and development. They build up a welfare state over time. And now this is a real welfare state as a high income country. But in the beginning, carefully doing this, but then also going very actively, a sugar exporter. They were leading proponents of a good deal with Europe on the Lomé conventions, that the kind of trade deals, early trade deals. They were early movers of the export processing zones. They called in the IMF in 83, 84 for structural adjustment. By 1987, they were growing at close to 11% per year. and exporting manufacturing. They're now a big financial sector. So again, the agency of people and the way the elite comes together can actually determine that you don't have to fall into this trap. So my argument is really about agency matters. There are constraints in it. History will and institutions factors matter, but there is political agency of those people with power and influence. And again, not just the prime minister or the finance minister, but the business elite and whatever. And so last week, that was my preaching in Nigeria, and the press covered it quite handsomely, is that basically they have a choice between the Nigerianization of poverty, because all projections suggest Nigeria will have the largest number of extreme poor by 2030, or a new elite bargain between business and the political class in Nigeria, because for God's sake, it really requires effort to run the economy so badly.
Thank you for these very powerful and candid words. That's much appreciated to hear your unfiltered view about what you've seen in your career. I was wondering about what you define as success. My understanding from the book is that your main lens is the eradication of extreme poverty, and that's maybe the primary thing you're looking at. Now, and actually, I'm slipping in a question received from the audience. We were wondering how do you think your reasoning and this question of development bargain applies a bit further up in the development ladder? Is it still key, in your opinion, to understand why some countries escape, say, the middle income trap and develop into full-fledged advanced economies? Or is it something that you feel is most relevant at the early stage of accumulation and development?
So in the book, I largely talk about the early stages, okay? And that's consciously to do it, but also it's where the experience that I had. I spent, as DFID was focused largely on the poorest countries, this is where I went. This is where I had time to spend and so on. So I didn't spend much time in Latin America, definitely not in the job as for the UK Development Agency. But I think, and it's really interesting, since then, and since the book has come out, I've spent time again in Bangladesh and now in Mauritius. These are countries in very different levels of development now. Bangladesh is on the brink of being middle income. Actually, what was the success factor of their early stage of development could potentially become now a limitation. It's in the following way, is that, take both these factors that I highlighted. The garment industry, when it emerged, these people were not politically powerful, but they could build up the garment industry. And they got a bit of support from the government, but there was no immediate rent capture and all these kind of things that could have happened in all kinds of other places. Now these guys are in parliament, and now they are blocking any form of industrial policy to any other sector but to the garments. So the most of the support still goes to the garments. Well, actually, we desperately need to diversify that economy and move into other sectors. So just was there where the engine of success, they may now become the risk factor in stagnation. I wouldn't say the same thing with the NGOs, but at some point, in terms of the complexity of what you need to deliver, the state will need to be better at social sector delivery than actually it can't just be about almost charitable organizations funded by aid to do this. You need a much more sophisticated model of doing it, and the state will probably play a role in that. So in all these cases, the state has to evolve. And that's now the challenge of Bangladesh. So, and that's the beginning of middle income. Actually, the more I look around now and here in Mauritius as well, all the time these elite bargains have to evolve. In fact, for the reasons that we were alluding to earlier, is that when growth happens, new elites emerge. That means new elite bargains have to be made. And you can't have anyone blocking. And that actually is the real challenge. And we talk a lot about these growth spurts. Len Pritchard likes to have all these papers, Gunnar Sen, they have some really nice things. And descriptively, a lot of growth are spurts and they fizzle out. And I think it has a lot to do with that inability to overcome the underlying political economy challenge, to actually restructure. What is your earlier success needs a new configurations. It may actually need a different type of leader and so on. Think of it in Indonesia. That has now had about 50 years of about 3-4% per year growth consistently, except for a brief period in 1997, with the Asian crisis. So an interesting thing with that is that Suharto and his team were definitely the architects of the early period from 1970 until 1997. Indonesia going to middle income, it needed to rethink how it handled its politics. It needed to go for a more democratization in their case. That was what worked for them, and they had to do it. So if you go to Latin America, and I'm very pleased and actually quite struck how many reviews I've had in Spanish and in Portuguese about the book, and how much comment and Twitter traffic I've had in these languages, which is actually really interesting because I never wrote about any of these places. They recognize very much, I think, in Latin America, the role of all of these elites that at some point may have been the growth factor, and then become the blocking elite that doesn't want to change because it will challenge their position. So I'm working hard at a series of translations of a few pieces in Spanish and Portuguese to feed to the Latin American market, because I think there's an interesting debate to be had indeed in middle income countries as well, in terms of how to rethink these elite bargains. Actually, at the moment, I'm traveling quite a lot. It's a lot that I want to look at middle income countries now, what's going on there, and how this kind of thinking can be helpful there. You know, if I find it's not, then I will ditch it. But I have an impression, it's a general framework. This requirement to keep on having that focus on growth and development is quite essential, I think, when societies evolve.
So I'm not sure this is great news, because if I understand well, first of all, you were telling us that there's no magic recipe. Now you're telling us that even if you find the right recipe, the recipe actually changes over time, and you need to adapt. I find that, of course, very, very, very insightful, but also a lot of work for policymakers and those who are trying to help them along the way. But precisely, I wanted to turn a bit to action and maybe, let's say, individual agency in that landscape. And to start with, we'll talk maybe about outsiders afterwards. But if we think about policymakers from these countries, people who have some agency, but are not at the very top of the government ladder, and who want to make a difference, and who are aware of the political economy considerations that you're developing in your book. At an individual level, what do you think is possible to do, and how can that be taken into account in advancing one's work towards economic development?
Yeah. So maybe the first thing to say is that, you know, in most societies, people have some agency, at least to do some good things. That doesn't mean that they necessarily can change, okay? There's a difference between being able to do sensible, reasonable things, good things, doing things better, more efficiently, more distributionally sound and whatever, even if they can't change the system. So a mid-level civil servant still has a role to play to work within it. But, you know, what I find interesting in these countries is that you do find typically, and yes, it's typically not at junior level, it comes almost by their nature, but like in mid-level people that are involved in business, that are involved also in civil service, that actually can nudge along the edges of the whole system. So I'm a strong believer in civil servants. I've been one, you know, public servants. It's actually something that is, you know, they don't, in most countries, don't have terribly good reputation, but, you know, well-intentioned can actually, because, you know, they are the ones that need to implement what politicians want. They actually have a big role in also shaping the thinking and so on. And that definitely was my experience, that they can be quite influential. Okay, so I'll give you a little bit away of what was happening in Nigeria. I had a closed sessions with the 43 most powerful civil servants, a closed session. You know, one suggested that the only way Nigeria will change was a revolution. That's quite interesting from as a top civil servant to hear that. And actually, there was a lot of debate that said, no, actually, we are still quite powerful, even though we are not controlling, and the political class is here a very powerful business class. We can actually, you know, within, you know, most countries are actually fairly good laws, so we can actually stop them doing certain things. Yes, we're taking risks. We have to pick our battles, choose our windows of opportunities where we can do it. The same in civil society. They can push in many societies, if not most, for some transparency, from some nudging along the edges. So I think People can do things. But at the same time, we should have a bit of humility that actually those who really can do the change are probably still this elite. And the simple reason is because they have blocking power. The one power that the elite has, and that's the kind of pessimistic version of the book, the one blocking power that the elite has is to block things, because they can actually stop it. So you need to find entry points of some players within it that want to change and so on. At the same time, if I look around, I've seen finance ministries in developing countries that actually have very smart technocrats playing the game very smartly, but actually creating the conditions. In all the countries that I looked at, where there's Ghana, Ethiopia, also in Indonesia, you can almost name the individuals in the government. They were not the most powerful people, but actually were very important in driving the change. So I always encourage an economist in these places and say, just align yourself with person X, Y, and Z. And there are these in these countries, and they would know them. Say people that are actually totally honest, that are really committed to have to actually get growth and develop it in the country. Say, align yourself, strengthen them, support them, give them a bit of more attention, make sure that they become unsackable, that they can't really be blocked. And then you make bits by bits, lots of progress. But but the blocking power of the elite, don't underestimate it. So we have to have a bit of humility that a simple sentence like, as long as we spend some money on civil society, everything will change. I'm afraid that's not as easy as that.
So I didn't realize we would be covering career advice here, but I think it's given the audience where we have a lot of current students during their grad studies. I think that's very an important thing to keep in mind as well in terms of individual strategies. Now, precisely, I want you to turn back to these people, maybe those you call the outsiders, because we don't live in a closed, these countries, the countries you're talking about in your books, don't live as a closed system. There are lots of exchanges with the external parties, which, you'll tell us, but to some extent might be part of this elite system that you describe. So for people looking at this situation from the outside, and I'm thinking about people like you used to be in government, in aid organizations, people like us at the Growth Lab who research these topics, but with a view to improve policy. All these people are from the outside. How do you think they can play a positive role in the development process? And maybe also, what do you see as no-goes? What do you think we as outsiders should not be doing?
Yeah. So the one thing as an outsider that we definitely shouldn't be doing is peddling the idea that it's all easy, that we all have a nice silver bullets, that it's so obvious that tech will change it all, or some kind of one intervention, as long as we scale it, will change it all. So don't do it. I was in Kenya the other day, talking to a radio station, but also giving a talk to some of the international community, young aid workers and so on, and we came to some kind of line is that there's probably 4 times too many people driving 4x4s than actually people who knew the context of these places. So the first thing, what you shouldn't do is to go to these places thinking, I don't need to know anything about these places. And that's actually general advice. I worked in a capital, worked in London on development aid. There's far too many people who decide things around some of these countries that have no clue about these places. So even if you're a technical economist, even if you run RCTs, even if you do very specific small things, invest in understanding these places. Because whatever you do, you're going to be far more effective in doing something if you start from some understanding. And understanding has to be not just the history, but that would help, not just the culture. Yes, learn the language, but also actually understand the politics, and not just the electoral politics through your own lens, but just very much, who matters? How is power here organized? How is it happening? Because without that, you're just never going to be very effective. So, and then come in terms of more constructively, how do we think about change then? Okay, so again, I know of interventions that will get children to learn much better than otherwise. I know of interventions that will help to make children healthier than another way. However, what I would want us to do is to all the time think about the underlying incentives. Why is the situation as bad as it is? Why is it that actually, what can we change about the incentives that it's not the outsider that needs to come and affect it? And how can we basically create positive incentives for better elite bargains, for elite bargains more for development, and actually stop some of the incentives for the very bad ones? Okay, so let's then think of three things. One thing is very obviously, this is where the economist comes into it, the economist in me comes into it. Once a country tries to export and tries to sell things to the rest of the world, the shenanigans, the kind of playing around by connected business with the government is actually much harder because you have to compete with the world. The political economy of export requires you not to just screw up the whole thing. It's not just about getting the contract from government anymore to be semi-corrupt or just work from the connections and the whole terrible elite bargains that we'll have from business that just live off the government. So exporting is a great thing. And of course, that's part of why it's been so successful to sustaining development bargains during a huge period of trade liberalization and so on. So that actually the countries that managed to start exporting, say, light manufacturing, which you need a bit of investment and learning how to do it, often kept on doing it because actually it gets a benign political economy as well. So there's actually a political economy reason for why actually export orientation is actually helpful. So anything we can do, and as I told people in Nigeria as well, anything that as a local elite or as an international community can do to get Nigeria to sell something else to the world than crude oil will be an amazing achievement because it will create business elite that has it in its interest to be actually doing something else than just living off the rents from oil and the political economy around it. So that's one thing. Of course, as so many people say, trades and globalization is half dead. I think there's still going to be opportunities because value chains will have to shift out of China. So Bangladesh and maybe Ethiopia could have huge opportunities, if they move in there because that's the moment. However, there's another thing of how can you create incentives that actually stop some of the worst elite bargains. So I think there's a huge opportunity now because of Ukraine. Why is that? Because, the US and European countries are countries of rule of law, which is, despite the fact that we have allowed all kinds of bad behavior by our companies, not our companies, but I meant financial services and lawyers and accountants and so on to help with a lot of illicit finance via whether it's directly or indirectly via Delaware or via London or whatever. Actually, because we're tightening all these laws, we actually get an opportunity to really properly at last fight illicit finance, not because of all the tax revenue that is lost to Buhari in Nigeria or to Kabila family in the DRC, but because of actually their terrible elite bargains are essentially funded through illicit finance. Myanmar, the regime would collapse if it couldn't rely on illicit finance anymore. That's actually really important, that these things that we actually change it. What do we do then? Finally, well, these are the things that we as outsiders can do. Then for the rest, when we then work much more locally, well, just don't take for granted that every program that looks good doesn't help to embed the elite bargain in a bad way. If I'm doing a health program in Nigeria, at least think a little bit about the fact that Nigeria spends the lowest share with budget on health. And it has partly these terrible health indicators because the federal government and many of the state level governments couldn't give a damn. That's not a good reason for us to step in and provide all the aid to the health systems in Nigeria. It's not a good enough reason not to do it, but at least let's think carefully about what are we doing in places where actually we need to step in with semi-humanitarian support because actually states are failing. I'm not arguing for sanctions or withdrawing from aid. I'm not illegally in that sense, but I'm actually asking us who want to do something to think carefully about what are we doing in these places with our aid, with our support, and keep in mind a good understanding of the underlying political economy of all the things we do. And so doing good is fine, but actually doing good may in the long term do bad if we're not careful, because we may set the incentives in such a way that actually we perpetuate future generations of children not to be able to go properly to school or learn, or indeed not to get the nutrition programs that we should have, even if we give the perfectly excellent little nutrition or learning program today to the children of today.
Thank you for this. Sounds like sounds inspiring and difficult at the same time. Let the audience reflect on that. And in the meantime, I took too much of your time myself, and I wanted to try to quickly switch to all the messages that we've been receiving, and maybe I can try to do this quickly so that we can cover most of them, hopefully. We got a very series of questions around what makes the elite take development bargains. So Karim is telling us, under what conditions do you think the elite will feel obliged to strike the development bargain? What will make them go from just protecting their own interest to pursuing wider development goals? And another person was saying, how much, and that's maybe more an anthropological type of question, more than an economic question, strictly speaking. They were asking, when a successful bargain occurs, how much are actors driven by patriotism versus self-interest? So I was wondering, if you had any take on that difficult question, which is how to make that bargain happen if it doesn't not happen naturally.
So no, this is an excellent question. It's of course quite a tricky one. You know, if you take a more case study approach as I was doing, and in each place it feels a little bit different of how it came about. I mean, just to be clear, you know, I'm kind of thinking in a world with multiple equilibria. At any moment in time, multiple outcomes are possible. And at some point, in some places, most of the time we settle maybe on particular expectations, equilibria. We pick these, we end up being there, but others could have been possible. So there's something to do with the agency here. And there is something to do with, you know, why would they switch to another equilibrium? Well, I think one thing would be anything that makes an equilibrium that is bad, unstable. Okay. And actually, it's basically, if you can disrupt it, you know, there may be a chance that you move to another one. Now, I want to be careful, you know. I remember Jim Robinson being very excited when Why Nations Fail came out during the time of the Arab Spring. And he had a lot of talks in Northern Africa and the Middle East, and they were going around and said, this is your moment, this is your moment. Looking back at it, of course, yes, they shifted an equilibrium, but probably it was a worse one than they were before, you know, and there was a massive capture. So, you know, anything that's destabilized the equilibrium may give us a chance to move to a better equilibrium, but just as well, it could get to a worse as well. And I think that's probably, for example, why there is such a clear case that in so many places, after conflicts, the development bargain may have emerged. But we know that the best predictor of conflict is whether you have past conflict. So most of the time, conflict leads to more conflict, but occasionally, it actually gets us somehow an expectations equilibrium. Surely we should do this better. And I think that's probably what happened in Bangladesh. Surely we need to do this better. This definitely happened in other places as well. But then you have legitimacy seeking behavior. You know, basically, it's another source of saying, look, I may actually not be able to keep my equilibrium stable. I need to get legitimacy, and otherwise I will lose my power. I need to go. So I think in a lot of Western countries after the world wars, that must have been one of the driving factors. Similarly, you know, you get it in quite a few places in China. So you get these kind of moments that you need to grab. And that's actually makes it, the other part of it as well, important. I keep on also referring to it, I've done it a few times today, around the agency of the people in the elite. That actually there are these moments that can be taken, but actually sometimes they just slip away and then they go somewhere else. So it does mean there is some role of individuals, of agency. I'm not a big believer that's all about the one person that puts it together. You know, the Lee Kuan Yew, like in Singapore, that supposedly brings it all together. I try to avoid this question around needs the leader, but you do need somehow groups within the elites that actually want to actually go for collectively, implicitly, it's not going to be a signing ceremony, but somehow they get to somehow doing it. South Africa often is referred to as a moment under apartheid that the business community realized, our game is up. We better start talking to the ANC and are willing to do a deal, which is arguably what the South African deal was post-apartheid, a deal between ANC and then the business community. So you get that somehow. Where does nationalism fit into it? Well, it's often one way of using, you have terrible elite bargains that are built around nationalism, that are just exploitative and whatever. But you also have good ones. In Indonesia, that was part of the elite bargain, the narrative around the Indonesia, the kind of the ideas around it. It can be used. I think basically this is where leadership comes into it. A smart leader finds a good narrative to do this. So rather than having the commander-in-chief who tells you all, this is the new elite bargain, you get the communicator-in-chief who actually managed to get a language to the elites and to actually start using it. And then you actually start being able to sell it both to the elite and maybe also to the population. Because let's not forget, often in the population, they may not be immediate fans for it because a development bargain and growth means so often investing in the future, but that means consumption less today. So it may actually be some hard decisions to be taken as well that are unpopular. So you need to have it. So I think nationalism can help with that narrative. I don't believe that nationalism is, I come from Belgium, we've all kinds of problems with nationalism, but let's not go into that. But it can be used by leadership actually in a constructive way. And so, it can play its role. But you need a narrative. It could be national, it could be another narrative, a developmental narrative. And then whatever works, basically, again, context specific, whatever works, let's try to find it locally, what works.
Thanks. Actually, this is a nice segue to the next question that we received, which I suspect was asked by a fellow microeconomist of yours. The question is around the use of RCTs to inform what we do in terms of political economy. How do you feel they can contribute, and maybe other types of research can be useful to build evidence and to inform political economy type of research, and especially in a context, as you just stated, where things are so context specific?
So look, one thing, I do my RCTs as well. One thing I'm not going to try to diss is trying to say, you shouldn't be doing this. You can answer questions. You get relatively precise answers to questions doing this. Okay, so it tells, I remember Abhijit Banerjee once saying when I was chief economist at DFID, and he came and said, look, it tells us what's possible. It tells us what's possible. If you're in your controlled circumstances, you can't even get it to work, maybe you shouldn't even be doing it. Okay, so that's fine. So that's the one thing there. I am worried about, as a research tool, I'm a big fan. I'm worried about overstating the relevance in using it. And people talk about, we can test the scaling up and whatever. But, once it meets a political economy, that determines, there's a lot of really good interventions that are not being implemented, say, in the UK government, even though it's supposedly totally evidence-based. There's just no way we could do certain things because it hits on politics and it won't be done. Interestingly, and I think the question here alludes to also how to actually think smartly about political economy within it. So I'm actually a very big fan of, and there were some, there used to be at the time at Oxford with me, there is, for example, in education, this really neat paper on Kenya that took an intervention that Michael Kramer and colleagues had done in NGO schools and said, okay, what happens when it meets state schools? And they had a really interesting thing where they can't fully prove it, but their most plausible explanation was it hit a political economy of the teacher unions. So the successful program didn't work anymore because it hits this. So I'm very much a fan of trying to actually think through these things and allowing also in URCTs, allowing it to hit political economy in an explicit way. You may not be able to fully change it, but actually to think about it. Finally, in my book, I document quite a lot civil society interventions, things that you can do in Ghana and in Kenya, why they are quite effective. There's lots of good evidence of all kinds of things that may work and not work. I also know very good reasons why they wouldn't work in Nigeria, and you should be willing to begin to develop a bit of a political economy understanding why certain things that may work in Ghana, in Kenya, in the democracies as they have, may not have much impact in Malawi and in Nigeria. And it would be so much richer if we're willing to bring some kind of good case study understanding why actually, it's a question of external validity, but actually just context understanding of the context of why implementation would look so different in different places. So let's marry these things, and definitely that's my own commitment to do a bit more like that.
Great. Maybe I noticed where it's already time, but if I may, I wanted to ask you in closing something that's come up in different questions from the audience, which were more about what you feel the nice questions are. We talked about the methods, but maybe in closing, it would be interesting to hear from you, from your experience and what you've seen both on the academic side, on the government side, and on the ground. A bunch of maybe students or young researchers here are curious to hear your views. What do you think are exciting questions right now that needs to be answered by academics, but also by more applied researchers such as us at the Growth Lab?
So I suppose there is one set of questions that is actually trying to touch on this distinction that I was trying to make between doing good and actually getting to change, some serious change. And I think would be quite helpful, I think, to actually start thinking more about it. There's a lot of very awful contexts, and just to be blind to these circumstances and simply saying, oh, it's all just some humanitarian doing good kind of stuff, that's all what we can do. No, I think, we want to study how we can change incentives, both economic and others, in this kind of system. So I would just like us to do just far more engaged in what is happening in these very difficult places, because these are the ones that, there's not much going on. So it's fragile, conflict affected. I'm very excited these days about actually trying to bring some rigorous research methods to humanitarian work as well, because this is where the context, where we have so little evidence, and where we then also all the time have to think carefully about the political economy there as well. I'm very keen myself to try to think, what does the impact agenda look like when you allow for political constraints and implementation as well? Would you actually still advise for the same things to be scaled if you kind of more explicitly analyze, maybe with other methods, the kind of constraints it hits? And so, there's a really interesting paper, actually it is by Jim Robinson and Darren Asimoglu in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, I think it was in 2013, where they have a very simple model where you're actually saying, rather than simply thinking through the economic advice you give, how does it improve the economy, but actually dynamically think how whatever advice you give, how does that feed through to the political incentives as well? If we could do at a micro and a more macro level to build this in much better, we'll actually begin to really properly integrate sensible economic thinking with sensible political thinking. At the moment, we're not really integrating that much. And so I think there's a lot of stuff. And then the final thing I'm saying, look, anyone who does any research on any country, just invest in understanding what's going on. And I read too many papers where I really think, my God, they have no clue what kind of place this is. And please read, learn about these places. That's actually one part of the agenda we should do about localization and the whole, empowering of these countries and people there, is to actually give them the courtesy that even if we sit at Harvard or in Oxford, that we actually try to understand why they are, where they are, and what's going on in these places, rather than treating them as pure technocratic problems where we can deal with some kind of, whether it's an experiment or another kind of paper, I don't care, but understand a little bit better these contexts, and we'll be better researchers as a result.
Thank you. That's a conclusion that's hard to disagree with, but I feel maybe a nugget of wisdom that we can keep with us after this talk. I can believe it's already past time that 1 hour has gone by. There is so much more in the book, and I really encourage viewers who are interested in the type of issues we discussed today to dive into the specific country examples that you described in the book. I think they will learn a ton, not only about these countries, but about how to think about the issues we discussed today. This was a great time. Professor Dercon, thank you very much for visiting us today. And I hope we'll have a new event, and you'll come again with a new book, new papers, and new things to discuss to tell us more about the work you're doing.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you so much, Clement. It was an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Thanks.